Welcome to the Imagine Belonging at Work podcast, brought to you by Rhodes Perry Consulting. I am your host, Rhodes Perry. So I have a question for you. Do you ever feel like you're stuck in a professional persona? You show up, put your head down, and power through the workday, but a nagging sense of inauthenticity lingers. Maybe you crave deeper connections with colleagues, or you dream of a career that aligns with your true values. Here's the good news. Authenticity isn't just about feeling good at work. It's the key to unlocking a more fulfilling and successful professional life. Yet the idea of being your authentic self at work might sound daunting. After all, wouldn't that mean sharing every quirky detail about your personality? The good news is that authenticity isn't about unfiltered self-disclosure. It's about bringing your core values, your strengths, and your passions to the table in a way that feels appropriate to the situation. So think of authenticity as the foundation of trust. When you show up as your authentic self, you create an environment where others may consider doing the same. Yet when you lack the agency or the choice to determine how much of your real self you want to bring into your work, authenticity won't be an option. And if authenticity isn't an option, then growing trust, the ultimate business currency, that's not going to be an option either. So agency is about power, and naturally those of us who hold more power at work may treat authenticity as a dial. You can turn it up or down depending on how relevant a personal detail is to the work at hand. Yet for those of us who hold less power at work, bringing our real selves is not necessarily a choice. It could be a liability at times. So how do we grow our collective agency to realize the authenticity advantage? Well, today we are really fortunate that our featured guest, Don Mamone, offers their insights on this episode of the Imagine Belonging podcast. So Don is a renowned identity coach who teaches others how to reach their maximum potential and impact by discovering and embracing their true identity. As a non-binary person, Don supports their clients to build safer spaces that support and encourages unapologetic authenticity. So Don will explain how authenticity can lead to increased trust with your colleagues, leading to better feedback, career development opportunities, and potentially even promotions. So you'll also learn how authentic connections with colleagues can create a more positive and supportive work environment, boosting your overall well-being and happiness. So this conversation, it's designed for you. It's designed for organizational leaders, DEI professionals, and other people leaders on the way to joining us. So I invite you to savor this really exciting conversation. And if you'd like to connect with thought leaders like Don after our live podcast recordings, go ahead and check out the Belonging membership community, where after these conversations, we get to have laser coaching sessions with our guests. So you can check that out at belongingmembershipcommunity.com. For now, this is the moment you've been waiting for. Don, welcome to the show. I am super excited that you're here today.
Thanks for having me, Rhodes. I'm equally, if not more excited.
Yes, right on, right on. So I want to kick off the conversation number one by diving a little bit deeper into authenticity. What does it mean, right? What is it? And where are some of the misconceptions about what authenticity is, particularly when we talk about this conversation in the context of the workplace?
So first, I love everything we're talking about today already. And I think that authenticity is mischaracterized and misunderstood. I think it's also a deeply personal experience. The way that I describe authenticity as simply as I possibly can, no big 25-cent words, is to me, authenticity means being exactly who you are everywhere you go, no matter who you're with. And the reason that's so important is because when we enter different environments or different situations with different people, I feel like it's this metaphorical door that we walk through, and countless people take an inventory of their different bags and boxes and packages and think, okay, so as I go through this door, I have to put these ones down. And the minute we do that, we acknowledge that there's something about ourselves that we no longer either love, are proud of, are willing to stand up for. And every time we do that, it's sort of this little piece of us that falls into a place of insecurity, lack of confidence, lack of courage. And ultimately we are depriving ourselves and everybody else that we're about to meet of our true selves, our true potential, our maximum impact. And that is a lot of what I do, a lot of what I focus on, and the journey that I've been on. We can get into it, we can talk in details. I put all my boxes and packages down. What felt like for the better part of 40 years. I was like, well, I can't take any of this in there with me. So I'll just leave that here and go in and be exactly who these people need me and want me to be.
I totally appreciate that. And the community of folks that I work with are pretty familiar with my own story of kind of earlier in my career being a trans person and really, just the challenges and the constant mental gymnastics of how much of my real self can I bring. And at what point could that be a liability, even going into thinking about job security in and of itself. So I know we'll dive deeper into that. And but before going there, this is a piece that I imagine in the work that you do, definitely in the work that I do, there's this tension piece of kind of this vulnerability, right? Of kind of taking that responsible risk and kind of trusting those around you, that they will kind of take care of the things that are most precious to you when you do share it, when it's relevant in different situations. So there's that vulnerability component versus the oversharing component, the too much information, TMI type things. So because authenticity can involve some degree of vulnerability, how can we share more of the things that are most precious to us when in situations when it matters, of really kind of building trust with those around us without overstepping those kind of quote unquote professional boundaries, right? Like when it's appropriate in a situation, like how do you kind of address that particular nuance?
That is an incredibly intricate and complicated question. And I think that one of the things that we get to keep in mind, and I'm going to pollinate, right? I don't think we can dig too deep into any one of these. And so I'm going to share some things and I would love for you to sort of attach onto whatever it is you feel is the most fruitful. Number one, I think that there's a difference between keeping a secret and keeping something private. And when we talk about authenticity, when we think about the fact that we have to keep this secret, it lends itself to believing that there's something about ourselves that we're not allowed to share, as opposed to something that we believe is personal and therefore doesn't need to be shared or doesn't get to be shared because it's something that we believe is something that we want to keep secret, or excuse me, private. So I think that's number one. Number two, there's a certain element in this of shared space, shared information. And I'll be perfectly transparent in this space and say, I typically believe that I am the barometer for all things what I choose to share. And that's because if when I walk into a room now, as a gender non-conforming, non-binary person whose gender expression tends to lend itself towards the feminine side of the spectrum, I can be inconvenient for a fair number of people, especially since I reside in the state of Texas in the city of Dallas. And if I were to say, well, this is TMI, me wearing a dress, me wearing a skirt, me wearing a makeup, it means that I am not allowed to be authentic. I've suddenly taken away that agency to be exactly who I am everywhere I go, no matter who I'm with. And so I think that we get to evaluate personally how we believe we get to show up. And in many occasions, have to have the courage and the self-confidence to say, I'm entering this space as my authentic self. My authentic self is valid, is worth respect, is worthy, is valuable. And therefore, if that's a problem for you, that's a you problem, not a me problem.
Yes, I really like that. Kind of that distinction of thinking about secrecy versus privacy, and those are two very different things. And if you find yourself kind of erring more on the secrecy side, that might reflect kind of a situation, a workplace setting, or just a situation within a workplace setting where maybe there's a lack of safety, right? Of really kind of trusting those around you to be able to hold the information that's most precious to you. And I mean, in at base, right? Like you're talking about just kind of showing up and how you're expressing your gender in professional ways, right? But it might challenge the expectations of what maybe colleagues around you would have, right, for you, and that can create a dangerous situation, or at minimum, an unsafe situation. So I want to kind of build on that because I think it comes there's a piece of agency like what I was talking about in the beginning, the opening of this interview. And in thinking about that it's important to determine how much of your real self you want to bring, that you want to bring. So that kind of goes into the privacy piece. Some of us are more likely to share. We might describe ourselves as extroverted. That's just kind of, we're talking about the relationships that matter most to us, the things that matter to us as it relates to whatever is being discussed in the workplace meeting. Whereas others, I mean, I definitely identify as an introvert. So it takes a long time for me to kind of just share in general, regardless
Yeah.
of if it's something more precious or not to me. So that I guess like that piece of privacy comes down to choice, right? And 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 I describe it as agency or having that power to decide how much that you want to bring into the workplace. So could you share how you might view this concept of agency or lack thereof that then influences how authentically we show up at work? So just to kind of expand a little bit more on what you just offered in your first
Yeah. So
response.
you immediately offered two things that I think are incredibly important. Number one, safety is primary to all things that we do. Um, I have this very bold, unapologetic brand. I created a brand called the Unapologetic Rebel to help people understand that we don't ask for permission to be who we are. We unapologetically live our life the way that we are. At the same time, there are environments in which I find myself where I think, okay, I teach people to show up, shine bright, be loud, be clear, and take up massive space. But this may be an environment in which I feel like my safety, physical, emotional, psychological, or otherwise, or those of the ones that I love, isn't assured. I'm not going to show up, shine bright, be loud, be clear, and take up so much space that I increase that level of no safety or lack of safety. So I think it's so important to remind the audience that we get to protect ourselves and that setting that boundary isn't a weakness, it is preservation, self-preservation. The other thing you mentioned that I think is spot on is the word choice. I tell my clients from the very get-go that the four words that will change their life forever is you get to choose. Because people oftentimes feel like they're either on this hedonistic chasing the horizon style treadmill where they're constantly running towards something, working hard, head down, can't wait to get there and never get there because the kind of horizon keeps moving. And that's not great, right? We get to live in a world where we get to choose. And that means in every way, shape, and form. And if I apply that here in sort of a metaphorical or hypothetical way, taking an environment, a workforce, a culture, a place in which you exist, and a place that you really do love. Every minute of every day, there's probably what feels like a million decisions to be made when you're discussing or deciding whether or not to be who you are, genuinely authentic. And let's take somebody like me who's gender nonconforming, right? For the longest time, I had pages and pages and pages of fallout, of consequences, of the things that I would just have to say goodbye to if I lived my authentic life. You never know which of those will actually come to fruition, but our mind and our body is really good at catastrophizing everything.
Yeah.
And so, what I want to try to do is, I want to have your audience elevate to the level of looking at that from 50,000 feet. Okay. Instead of looking at it as each individual decision, I want to remind them of something. And then I want to share a brief anecdote before we move on. In the end, after all the decisions are made, if authenticity is the decider, the apex, the origin of your decision making, the fallout will always be less than the windfall. The fallout, whatever you lose, whatever consequence there is, whatever people don't stay in your life, whatever job you choose to leave and a job you choose to join, it is always less. It is always a net positive. Okay. And the story that I love to share is I was 41 years old when I told the first organic life form on this planet that there was something different about me. And I had known since I was like 5. And it was a very difficult conversation, the kind of choking through sobs, unable to say words type of conversation. And it was to my wife, who I've at the time was married to for 7 years, and we're about to celebrate our 15-year wedding anniversary.
Congratulations.
Yes,
Yeah.
amazing. I won the karmic lottery of spouses. That's all there is to it. I remember talking to her about it and going on this journey with her. And a few years later, like we so often do as parents, we got this rare moment to go out and we were on the freeway. We were sitting in traffic and she looked over at me and she said, Don, I just want to say something. And my wife's not the big orator. I'm the orator. I'm the one on podcasts. She's the one who interjects and says the most insightful, beautiful things. And she's a musician and a lyricist and all these things. She said, and so when she talks, you listen. She says, Don, I want you to know that since you came out and since you've gone on this journey of authenticity and finding who you are and showing that to the world, you're a better everything. You're a better spouse, parent, employer, employee, client, brother, spouse. Everything is better about you because you are who you are unapologetically. And I just wanted you to know that. And it was really a reinforcement for me that all the decisions I made, all the tears I'd shed, all the times that I had walked so unbelievably fearfully through the fire to become the person who's now like, hey, listen, I'm sorry, this is me. If that's a problem for you, that's a you problem, not a me problem. It took all those steps to get there. And so if I can fast forward your audience to know that that's the experience, almost every person I've ever worked with, every time I've seen it, the outcome is they look back and they're like, wow, I'm so much better. My life is so much better. Everything is so much better now that I can just be who I am.
Love that. I love that. And I know we were chatting before we hit record, and you were talking about working in corporate for over a decade, right? And uh I imagine, and I'm curious of hearing more of those experiences of kind of the contrast to this magnetic kind of being that you are today, right? Where it's this
Mm-hmm.
like the more that you kind of show up in your truth, you're providing possibility to other people that collaborate with you, that are in your life. And that's attractive, right? Like people gravitate
Mm-hmm.
towards those who are really themselves. And because there's no one like you, right? It's like the Oscar Wilde quote, like be yourself, everyone else is taken. And I think when we own those roles, there's something unique that we're contributing, whether it's at the workplace or in our communities or in our families. Um, so so I know that that hasn't always been the reality for you in workplace settings. And whether you want to kind of focus on yourself or kind of the clients that you work
Mm-hmm.
with right now, there are real costs that are incurred when we constantly have to compartmentalize some of the things that are relevant to a workplace situation. I mean, I think you and I could have an entire podcast on this kind of like from a gender perspective, the perspective that we're able to bring into workplace environments, whether it's designing products or a process or something. There's a unique lens that I think so many of us who are trans and non-binary bring, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that can extend to any kind of difference or different lived experience that anyone listening, has. So talk to us a little bit about the cost of avoiding, showing up more as yourself when you do have that agency, and in ways maybe that you coach those clients that you work with around what you were just talking about, like that reality of, hey, the more that you kind of orient and go to that North Star, which is kind of like your truest form of being on this planet, the, like things will shed, there will be loss, like whether it's relationships or things that you used to love doing or that you had to do, right? Like how do you help people work through that kind of that felt sense of loss, or how you described it as catastrophizing, to
Yeah.
then kind of get to the good stuff of showing up and shining brightly.
It's so interesting because I think that my clients don't believe me at first. At first, they have this feeling of like, well, I don't get to choose because they've been in a place where they've allowed the world to choose for them for so long. And I don't mean unilaterally, right? Like people typically choose what job to take, but once they're in that job, or once they're in that association, or once they're in that body of people, that community of people, humans are little seekers of belonging, acceptance, approval, and the idea that we would already be entrenched in these places, and then we would suddenly choose to be like, nope, I'm out, or this is me. And if that's not okay with you, then go ahead and I'll be out. Whatever the case is, they feel sort of pinned in. And so when I say, like, listen, this is going to be really hard for you to hear, but from today forward, I want you to acknowledge that everything that you do it comes back to the fact that you get to choose. That is the very first step to sort of the authenticity journey, is you sit down and you say, I choose to be me, not do what I'm expected to do or do what I'm allowed to do, right? One of the keynote talks I give that is one of my most popular is step into you, stop doing, start being. And it's this sort of dilemma of, well, doing and being, it's essentially the same. Like language is so important, Rhodes, and I know you know this because I can already tell just based on your cerebral way of looking at the world. Like when you say something's hard, that's different than saying that something's complicated. And so when I say something like, hey, when you're going to do versus be, it's very different. And so that moment when people say, okay, I'm committed to being exactly who I am, the next question is, well, wait a minute, who am I? And where do I come from? And what influences and experiences have impacted that? And, I do work a lot with the LGBTQ plus community, but I also work with a lot of people that would consider themselves cis het people that look at the world and are like, I'm a white collar worker and I'm doing that because that's what I've always done. But I'm a creative deep down inside. And I've always wanted to write music, or I've always wanted to play an instrument, or I've always wanted to be an actor, or I've always wanted to. And they didn't because they believed that the world didn't afford them that option, when in actuality is they declined to make that decision. And so I've got like this fun 4-step framework because I want to try to keep it as simple as I can for everybody I work with. And the hardest part is making the decision. The hardest part is realizing that you get to choose, right? And if you sit down with me and you say, I am going to be exactly who I am, I'm like, great, who is that? And you start looking at your life and you start noticing things. And the first step to this small 4-step framework is acknowledgement. We get to acknowledge something about ourselves, something about our lives. And that's enough. That's really hard. Sometimes the acknowledgement, we've denied it, we've suppressed it, which we're using all that energy, right? You ask the question, like, what's the cost? Well, the cost is that you're spending all this time and energy suppressing this stuff, which is energy and thought and creativity you can't use for anything else because you got to protect that secret, got to protect that thing that we're hiding or denying. So if you just acknowledge it, check that box, like that's huge. The next thing is you accept it. Now I've noticed it, I've acknowledged it, now I'm going to accept it, which means I'm going to welcome it. It's part of my life, it's part of me, it's part of who I am. There it is. The next is you're going to embrace it. And I use the word embrace because I really literally want you to find this thing about you and give it a hug. It is sad and lonely all by itself. So pull it forward and bring it forward and give it a hug and start to love it about yourself. And then lastly, my favorite is when you harness the power of this thing about you. It's the moment when someone realizes the thing they thought was their kryptonite, it was going to bring them down, it was going to take away their power, is actually their cape. It's their superpower. Yes. And not only will it not bring you down, it will allow you to change the world. So once you go through that framework, once you go through those steps, it leads you to unconditional self-love. And the reason that is because every time you acknowledge it and every time you accept it, embrace it, and take ownership of it, you say, okay, here's the thing about me. I love it. You may not like it very much. There's lots of things about me, Rhodes, that I don't necessarily like all that much. But if it's a part of me, I love it, because to love yourself unconditionally creates opportunity in your life that you can't get any other way. So that's the process. That's the journey. And that's how we know on the other side, the windfall will always be more than the fallout.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So that authenticity advantage is really huge. And it starts with that kind of like making that choice, acknowledging the pieces that make you a superstar, right? That differentiate you from everyone else. And I kind of want to go back to what we were talking about, which is it's a big theme that folks in the belonging community that I run are focused on this year, which is this concept of moving at the speed of trust. How are we cultivating trust in ourselves, right? Like to kind of own who we are, trust kind of interpersonally with the people we collaborate with, and then trust in the work that we're leading. And when we show up more as ourselves, whether in our families, communities, at work, it allows others to bring more of themselves to the relationships that we're building with them or co-creating. It's unfolding before us. And I take a move towards you, I share something, you receive that with care, you feel safer to do the same, right? And it's kind of magic, I think. And trust at the end of the day, I believe is ultimately in the world for the ultimate business currency. Trust really kind of forges really amazing things. So talk to us a little bit about how you view the role of authenticity in building stronger relationships. And obviously we're centering this around the workplace. So like when you're guiding your clients through the process that you just outlined for us, what are some of the shifts or changes that maybe they're reporting back to you around how life is different, in relationship with others that are important to them?
Yeah, I think the number one thing I realize and that I hear from my clients is a migration from the idea of what they're allowed to do or what they're expected to do and what they do based on who they are. And so I have this sort of narrative where I explain to people, one of the biggest concerns that people have is either validity or worth or value or this idea of imposter syndrome and enoughness. And one of the things that I state is when we start talking about authenticity and being, the idea of being enough is I mean, no other way to say it, it's absolute BS. Because what you're doing is you're taking your intrinsic existence and deciding whether or not you are enough. Enough is a measurement of capacity or a measurement of amount to the degree where you're saying, like, am I intrinsically enough? What an awful, terrible thing to subject anyone to, especially yourself. So, what I tell people is if you put 2 feet on the ground and you're breathing in and out, or you're rolling in your wheelchair, or you're showing up to do and to be exactly who you are intrinsically enough. There is no question that can be answered there. The only question can be answered is, do I have enough experience to stand in front of 5,000 people on this stage and adequately and educate them through a keynote speech? Do I have enough education to submit my name for this role in this company? Those are completely different questions than this idea of, am I enough? And so if we extrapolate that to a place of trust, authenticity, vulnerability. I wrote this recently. I'm working on a kind of putting all this thought into a book. And I wrote this the other day thinking about this concept of enough and trust. And I think people are so concerned that by being vulnerable, they'll be seen as weak. They're going to expose their soft underbelly. And nobody wants to do that because I will be vulnerable, meaning vulnerable to attack, vulnerable to something befalling me. There is no courage quite like the courage to be vulnerable and to be authentic. It is, in my mind, the definition of trust. Now, when we're in an environment where we are surrounded by people, sort of obligatory people that we work with, coworkers, clients that sign on, there's an opportunity where we get to place our trust in them, and maybe we worry that they're not all that trustworthy. These are the moments when we talk about secrecy versus privacy. At the same time, there's that third idea of confidence and courage that says it's not okay for me to be in an environment where I have to hide who I am. And so in the community of corporate America or in other organizations, I always think along the lines of cis, het, LGBTQ plus, because it's a very normative ability to talk about. Even still in corporate America, unless the culture has shifted, which is part of our job as a community, if someone gets hired, a lot of the question is, if they're male, the question is, what does your wife do? Or when do we get to meet your wife? Assumptions like that make the person have to choose to disclose whether or not, as a man, they have a husband at home, as a woman, they have a wife at home, or if their spouse is non-binary or gender non-conforming. In that moment, do they stand up for themselves? And by stand up for themselves, I mean correct that person and say, hey, you know what? Just want to let you know, my spouse is actually non-binary and they are a speaker, identity coach, and author. So the more often the person can find the courage, and put themselves into cultures and experiences where they get to be vulnerable, they get to be honest, they get to choose, I don't need to keep this secret. This isn't particularly private, so I'm going to offer it up. And then we find ourselves in a whole nother situation, Rhodes. And that situation is if you consistently find yourself surrounded by people that you feel like you can't trust, people that you feel like when you're vulnerable, instead of them holding you tight and embracing you and making sure that you feel comfortable, warm, safe, and included, you're worried that you are vulnerable to attack, then maybe that's not the right place for you. And then we get to come full circle back to step one, and that's you get to choose.
You get to choose, right? And I think like knowing the audience who tunes in, there's a lot of organizational leaders that, and just in the example that you provided, that might have been an aha moment, right? That might have been a, oh my gosh, I might have done that myself, you know. And if you're listening, please don't get in a shame loop. This is this is where we want to try to model some good behaviors here. So, you know, you're talking about, you know, and I'm just kind of hearing Brene Brown kind of in the vulnerability talk and kind of like daring to go into the ring, you know, to you know, exhibit this kind of bravery at times, because there's an unknown, right? There's an uncertainty when you're taking that responsible risk, right? Where it's like, you know, I feel like I have enough information where I just joined this company. I wanted to join. I see its values. I feel like I can share this, and it might be a test to see how people respond, right? Like you're kind of leaning into that responsible risk and sharing that, and not everyone can do that for sure. So for leaders, right, how might they be able to kind of embrace authenticity, right? Which could be a big stretch for some who kind of were just socialized in old models of leadership where you don't show any vulnerabilities because that, like you said, would exhibit some kind of quote unquote weakness. So how might they kind of shift some of these behaviors and model what vulnerability can look like to be more authentic about their own experiences in hopes of opening up more trust for others, right? Like kind of it's that first action where leaders are trying to earn the trust of those that they're leading by doing that work first in hopes that then other folks on the team will, when if they want to share a little bit more, will, in hopes of increasing those like real connections that are so important when you need people to have your back in a workplace situation. You know, I can reach out to you, Don. I know you're going to have my back on this, right?
Yeah. So I'm going to put a pin in that for 30 seconds. I'm going to say something that you just shared, and that's that this idea of the shame loop and this idea of shoulding all over ourselves gets to stop immediately. The number of people in the world that are shoulding all over themselves, like, oh, I should do this, I should do that. And then they listen to this podcast and they're so inspired. And they're like, I should be doing this. Please don't have that be your takeaway. I share with my clients the path, the journey. There are some tricks. There is a 4-step framework that I share with people. There are ways in which I can usher you along, but I tell everybody I work with, you get to do this in your own pace, at your own time, and in your own way. Okay. So everybody's journey doesn't start at the same time. It doesn't go as fast as the person next to you. And the journey is as diverse as the number of people that are on it. So anybody who's making you should all over yourself, just remember those 3 things. I'll do this when I'm ready, as fast as I choose, and whatever manner fits me. And what that does is it takes the power and it puts it right back on you, and you get to choose, right? And so to the analogy, if you're in that environment, you're like, today is not my day where I'm going to stand up and ring my little bell and have my sandwich board on that says I'm an LGBTQ community member. Fine. You still made the choice. You just get to acknowledge that you're going to start that journey and start that advocacy or start that identity and that authenticity when you're ready. So that was number 1. Number 2, leadership. I mean, aside from hiring me to do this, I think that it really is leadership by example, which means they get to do this work. I'm reminded of the idea of leadership being authoritarian or power, as opposed to sort of leading from the bench, right? Abby Wambach, I believe, was the person that wrote the book, like Leading from the Bench. Like, you don't have to be at the front, and you don't have to rule as a do as I say, not as I do, and this kind of really aggressive environment. Sometimes showing people your soft underbelly invites them to show their soft underbelly, and suddenly it doesn't make us weaker. It makes us communal. It makes everybody relatable to the other. And suddenly we're moving forward as a community, as a group. And so when I think of leaders, I would say that ironically, some of the hardest projects and jobs in the world, people suffer in abject silence. They just keep taking on the roles and the responsibilities and the number of people in the workforce and mitigating this and managing that. And they never ever, I think about the CEO who goes home and sits in his car before he opens the garage door or her garage door, or their garage door, and just cries in the car, thinking about the overwhelm because there's nobody in their life that they can cry to, cry in front of, say I'm depressed, say I don't know how to handle this, say I'm overwhelmed, say I'm overworked. That is going to be the sort of poison of the water hole. And so they get to do this work. They get to authentically show up and say, I am totally overwhelmed by this. I don't even know where to begin. And suddenly somebody in the group says, I don't either. But I'll bet you if we put our two minds together, something can be created that we could have never done alone. Let's go try that. And suddenly everything's moving in the direction they need to go.
I love that. And that is a big leap of faith, I think, for a lot of folks. And I love that kind of framework that you offered around just kind of thinking about actions, like as people are thinking about this conversation, right? And as you said, like trying to avoid a shame loop, of like just trying to do all of the things that might be ahas here. Is this really kind of like assessing your own readiness, like you said, figuring out what's possible, like what method is possible, and kind of going at your own pace, right? Like I think that that's really um, a simple framework, and also if applying, could be transformational in and of itself. Like just testing out something that was gained from this conversation, which might be, just testing with a trusted relationship, maybe in the workplace, maybe at home. Being a little more real about something that really matters to you, and see how that goes, right? And I think like those trusting relationships are a good place to test that out before maybe an unknown character in your life, maybe a new colleague or something like that. So um yeah, so Don, this is great. I really appreciate the insights that you've offered on this topic. It's a really important one. And, and I think the nuance that you offered is super helpful, just because I'm sure in the work that you do, you hear the term, be your authentic self, bring your real self to work all the time. And without kind of guardrails around how to do that in a way that it will take care of the person who's trying this, things could go sideways. So I really think that this conversation has been really instructive. I like to end just because the podcast is titled Imagine Belonging, right? And we're trying to think about the future world that we're collectively trying to co-create together. If you could just take a moment right now, imagine this kind of future of work, as a part of this new world, and the role that authenticity plays in shaping it. Talk to us about that vision, right? Like, what do you see? What might you be hearing or feeling, like kind of full sensory level? And how do you hope the work that you're leading, kind of thought leadership that you're adding to the world today, will help realize that vision?
Oh my goodness, what an amazing question. So I'm going to do instructional and anecdotal, educational and inspirational. I have a keynote that I give that focuses on the idea that everyone has a coming out story. I think it's largely been associated with the LGBTQ plus community now, because that is a formative moment in their life. When I started talking about gender identity and my coming out story, I was doing so to help people understand what gender nonconformity is, what gender identity is, and what my life has been like. And it has been incredible. But one of the things that I noticed right away was I would have people come up to me after the talk and they would say, oh my gosh, that was so powerful. And I was prepared for them to talk about gender identity or the LGBTQ plus community or their allyship. And a lot of times what they did was they would cry. And they would say, I saw myself in your story because I remember this time. And this is a true story. I remember the time that I was at my darkest when I was expected to be a doctor or a lawyer. I had no choice. And so I went ahead and signed up for pre-med, and I almost took my life in the middle of my junior year because I did not believe that I could be my authentic self. And I did not see a future that I could ever possibly be even a tiny bit content with as a doctor. So my only out was self-harm. And I thought, I gave the person a hug, and I thought, this is not how this gets to be. And they said, this is a really emotional moment for me, but please know, like, it's been 10 years. I'm a band leader now. I play the drums. I've never been happier. And I was like, oh my God, thank God for a happy outcome. But what I'm trying to get at is this world in which we have a coming out story. As much as I love the idea of the triumph of that moment, when fear turns to courage and doubt turns to certainty and shame turns to pride and everything is better, the world in which I want to create that doesn't even exist, because we take that time machine back to the moment when that person feels like they're not allowed to be who they are, and we erase it. And the anecdotal part of this story is my daughter. The reason that I came out to my wife after 7 years was because I had a 9-month-old baby girl and I was losing it. I was having panic attacks. I was suffering from sleepless nights. And at first I thought, well, this is the tension and the stress of being a parent and keeping an infant alive. And the more I talked about it, the more I was like, this is not normal. And what I realized was, I'm going to teach this precious young gift who relies on me to be her role model. I'm going to teach her that it's not okay to be who you are. And I immediately realized that wasn't the role model I wanted to be. I talked to my wife about it, and I started I want to use the right adjective, Rhodes. I started the excruciatingly long, difficult journey from being who I thought I was allowed to be to being exactly who I am. And I want to get rid of that journey for everybody in the world, because I'm trying to do that for my 7.5-year-old daughter, who now says things routinely like, the only way to find out what a person's gender is to ask them. And anybody gets to be whoever they want, love whoever they want, and do whatever they want, right, Daddy? Yep, that's exactly right. And does that include you, sweetheart? Yep, it sure does. So that's the world that we get to create together, Rhodes. You and me and all the people on this podcast get to come together and recognize that the only person that you get to be is exactly who you are. And that's everywhere you go, no matter who you're with, from the very beginning. It's not something we need to learn. It's just something that we are.
I think that's where we end this. This is such a powerful vision, Don, and I really appreciate you sharing some of those personal stories. Really powerful, really, really powerful. And I just kind of keep thinking of this not good enough, like you were kind of talking about that shame cycle, right? Like the not good enough and always striving and just being in that mindset and making that shift to just basically good. Like, what if right now you're good enough, basically good, and shining who you are in this moment, and the impact that that really does have on other people, and that truly is, when you're holding those spaces, whether keynoting or coaching, you are shining that light and that possibility for other people, and I thank you for doing that. So really great conversation, and I look forward to staying in touch with your work and collaborating and building that world together. For folks who've tuned in today, thank you so much for being here. It's always a pleasure to connect with you all and to introduce you to incredible thought leaders like Don. So if you found this valuable, if you'd like to kind of go into some coaching sessions with us in our Belonging membership community, I encourage you to check out belongingmembershipcommunity.com and stay in touch in terms of future conversations that we're going to have over the course of this year. We've got some great guests lined up. And thanks as always for helping us grow our belonging movement. We'll see you soon. Thank you.